moonlight on the river. That was the only thing Father Peter Pernin could see clearly when he looked up from the water. The rest was fire. He was standing chest deep in the Peshtigo River on the night of October 8th, 1871, holding the tabernacle above his head, the sacred vessel from his church, the only thing he had thought to grab when the building started burning around him. The water was full of people, men, women, children hoisted onto parents' shoulders, all of them facing the same direction, all of them watching everything they had owned and built disappear into the fire on both banks. By morning, some of them were gone too. What hit Peshtigo that night was not a fire in any ordinary sense. It was a firestorm. Superheated air that generated its own wind, moved faster than anyone could run, and consumed the town and 16 surrounding settlements before dawn. At least 1,182 people died. The records that might have settled the full count burned with everything else. You have probably never heard this story, and the reason for that has nothing to do with how many people died. By the fall of 1871, northeastern Wisconsin had been drying out for months, and the landscape showed it. Fields the color of straw, riverbeds running low, air that tasted of smoke from a dozen slow burns that nobody had gotten around to extinguishing. The logging industry had stripped the land bare across the region for decades, leaving behind piles of dry slash, branches, bark, sawdust, heaped in clearings and along roadsides that now acted as kindling waiting for a reason. Settlers had been burning stumps all summer to clear farmland, letting small fires run until they burned out on their own. The smoke was so heavy by early October that ships on Green Bay were navigating by compass at midday, because visibility had dropped to almost nothing on the open water. It had been that way for weeks and weeks, and most people had long since stopped expecting the air to clear. Peshtigo sat at the center of all of it, 2,000 people, a river running straight through the middle, a logging economy that had left the surrounding land in exactly the condition that made what happened next possible. Everyone there could smell what was building that fall. What none of them fully understood was how little time they had left before it arrived. The fire came from the southwest on the evening of October 8th, and it did not move the way anyone expected a fire to move. It did not creep through dry grass or spread slowly along the forest floor. The people of Peshtigo had lived with smoke all fall, and most of them had adjusted to the idea that the fires around them were manageable, distant, and slow. What hit Peshtigo was a firestorm, a phenomenon where heat becomes intense enough to generate its own wind system, drawing oxygen inward from all directions and creating a self-sustaining column of superheated air that can throw burning debris far ahead of the visible fire line. The town was gone in roughly an hour. Father Peter Pernin was in his church when he heard the sound coming. First like a freight train, then something louder than that, a roar survivors said had no comparison to anything they had heard before. He had 3 or 4 minutes from the first noise to the moment the building was on fire around him. He grabbed the tabernacle, the vessel holding the consecrated hosts, and ran for the river without stopping for anything else, without turning back. The people who made it to the water that night survived. Most of those who did not had very little time to act, and the fire did not wait for them to find any at all. The Peshtigo River ran straight through the center of town, and on the night of October 8th, it was the only thing standing between the people of Peshtigo and the fire. They had been running for it from the moment they heard the sound, and hundreds of them made it into the current before the fire reached the banks. They stood chest deep in the water, some of them, with the town burning on both sides and the air above the river hot enough to singe hair. Some people held their children above the waterline for hours. Some people went under and did not come back up. Pernin wrote about standing in that water surrounded by people praying in every language he knew, and several he did not, in English, in French, in German, and in others he could not identify, all of them mixed together in the dark above the current, while the fire consumed everything on both shores. He also documented something that the historical record cannot independently verify, but that multiple survivor accounts described in similar terms, that the people caught in the open near the fire's edge did not die the way fire victims typically die, that the heat was of a different order entirely. He wrote this without drama. He wrote it the way a man writes something he has spent 3 years trying to find the right words for. Peshtigo was gone before midnight, but the fire was not finished with Wisconsin. It had moved through 16 towns and settlements across the northeastern part of the state and into the upper peninsula of Michigan before it burned itself out, leaving a footprint that would eventually be measured at more than 1.2 million acres. The village of Sugarbush was erased entirely. Entire farming communities in Marinette County were gone, names on maps that are difficult to find in any surviving archive. The scale of what had happened that night was almost impossible to take in from inside the state, and all of it had happened on the same night that Chicago was burning. The Great Chicago Fire started on the evening of October 8th, the same evening, the same hours, likely driven by the same regional weather system that had been drying out the upper Midwest since spring. Chicago lost approximately 300 people and 3 square miles of city. Peshtigo lost at least 1,182, and possibly twice that, and nobody outside the state of Wisconsin knew it had happened yet. The reason was infrastructure. Chicago had telegraph lines and newspapers and reporters who could file wire stories to the Eastern press before the sun came up on October 9th. Peshtigo had telegraph lines too, until the fire burned them to ash that same night. The wire was gone before anyone could use it. By the time word finally reached Madison on October 10th, Chicago had already been the front page of every major newspaper in the country for 2 full days. The editors had their story for that week. There was no room left for Peshtigo and no wire left in Wisconsin to carry the story, even if there had been. That is the only reason you have not heard of it. Word did not reach Madison until October 10th, 2 full days after the fire had destroyed Peshtigo. The delay mattered enormously. It shaped everything that followed. Governor Lucius Fairchild mobilized state resources once he learned what had happened, and aid did eventually come. Food, clothing, and supplies arrived from communities across Wisconsin and donors in other states who responded once the news finally spread. But the survivors had already spent 2 nights in the ruins with no shelter, no food, and in many cases no way to account for the people they had lost. The fire had moved so completely that entire families had left nothing behind to identify. The dead were interred together in a mass grave in Peshtigo, because there was no other way to handle what the fire had done to the town and to the people who had not made it to the river in time. That grave has been maintained ever since, in the same quiet ground it has always occupied. Father Pernin spent the next 3 years putting down in writing everything he had witnessed, what he heard, what he saw, what the people around him said and did and prayed, and what he could not fully explain even at that distance. His memoir, published in 1874, is the most detailed first-hand account of the Peshtigo fire that exists. The Peshtigo Fire Museum opened in 1963, built on the same ground where Pernin's original church had stood and burned, and it has been keeping the documented record of that night for over 60 years for a country that has largely never thought to ask. It is still open. The record is still there and has always been. The country had its story that week, and the story was Chicago. And by the time the smoke in Wisconsin had cleared enough to begin counting the dead, there was no longer any room on any front page for what had happened in Peshtigo. That is the simplest explanation, and it is also the true one. A firestorm killed at least 1,182 people in a single night. The records that would have settled the exact number burned with the town, and the country moved on before it had a chance to notice, because the telegraph lines that might have carried the story burned in the same fire that killed the people. Father Pernin stood in that river for hours and held something above the water and did not know whether the people standing next to him would be there when morning came. The people around him prayed in English and French and German and in languages he could not name, all of them at once, for hours, in the dark above the current, while the fire burned everything they had built down to nothing on both banks. Some of them made it to morning. Some of them did not leave anything behind that could be found and identified, and those are the names that never made it into any record. The mass grave is still maintained in Peshtigo. The museum is still open. The church that stands there now was built on the same ground where the first one burned. Most people who pass through that part of Wisconsin have never heard the name of the town or understood what the ground beneath it carries. Some places hold weight like that quietly for a very long time. No front page, no Memorial Day, no moment when the country finally turns around and looks back. Peshtigo is one of those places, and it has been since the night of October 8th, 1871, and it will not stop. That's another voice from the hollow. If this one stayed with you, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. The stories America left behind.